So I'm going to take you through the Cold War here, the early years, the formation of the Cold War, and also kind of to look at the cause and effect of the Korean War. I'm really simplifying here, folks, so I'm telling you right now, you want to make sure that you visit these pages and really go through this. Yalta and Potsdam are actually at the tail end of chapter 28, so they are not in these pages. So make sure you read through them. And what we did in class was we're looking at how do we see each of these events show tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. And that's really what the Cold War is all about. It's a war of threats. It's a war of trying to outdo each other. And it's a war of really lining up all your nuclear weapons at each other and acting as if you're going to use them, but nobody wanted to. That's the thing. Because remember, we're at this point now in world history where humans have the power to end the world. And nobody wants to do it. But you have to act like you're not afraid to do it. And that's a big part of the Cold War. So let's break it down. Let's talk about how we get here. Tensions were already high, and I think we already saw signs of fracturing this relationship here at Yalta. And Yalta is where, of course, Stalin and Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met to discuss what to do with Germany. At this point, the Battle of the Bulge was over. It was clear Germany was going to lose. It was just a matter of time. So they made a couple of things, a couple decisions here. They agreed upon an occupation zone in Germany, and now each of the winners of the Allied powers here are going to take a zone and just supervise rebuilding and make sure that no Hitler-type guys rise to power in the rubble like what happened after World War I. Sectors were never supposed to be permanent, but that, of course, is what's going to happen. The other thing is that Stalin really asserted at Yalta that he should have the right to control or have a good, solid say in what goes on in Eastern Europe, specifically Poland. These two definitely saw through that and said, that's not fair. You can't control the elections in Poland, and we want to make sure we have free elections there. And Stalin said that his need for Poland and keeping an eye on Eastern Europe was purely for defense, and it was just he needed to make sure that his borders were safe and there weren't any more aggressor nations. And he also kind of threw it back at the United States and said, who do you think you guys are to say what I can do in Poland when you're basically doing the same thing in Cuba with your Platt Amendment, your Teller Amendment? You guys have to approve the Constitution and you have naval bases in Cuba. So how is that any different than what I want to do in Poland? So what we're going to see is that to keep Stalin in the war and keep him somewhat happy, they do sort of give in here and bargain away Eastern Europe to win World War II. So that's going to be something that will continue to affect us when the war is over. FDR dies in April 1945, so Harry Truman is now our new president, and there's Stalin, there's Churchill, and they're going to meet at Potsdam. And now Germany's been defeated, now we're talking about Japan. So the Potsdam Ultimatum is going to be what basically says to Japan, look, surrender or you will be destroyed. This is also where Truman, we learned, kind of hinted to Stalin at what he had with this weapon, but didn't really say it. He just said he had a weapon of unusual force. Didn't say more than that. Now, Truman really doesn't want Stalin to get in on this war because Stalin, you see how he operates. He's going to say, all right, I helped you. Now what's in it for me? We want to avoid that. And that's another thing that the atomic bomb is going to help do. It's going to keep this war, it's going to win the war without using Stalin and his troops. So that's another thing that we're going to see come out of this. All right, so once Germany's been defeated, this is George Kennan, and he comes up with something called the Long Telegram. That's kind of what it becomes known as. So in this telegram, what Kennan does is he outlines what everybody is really thinking, which is the Soviet Union is a threat. They are going to want to spread communism, and it needs to be our utmost goal to stop that. And we've got to make it official. We've got to look at how we could stop that and roll back communism. So this is where we first hear the policy of containment. Now, containment we'll get into that when we get into the Truman Doctrine here. But I also want to talk about what's going on here with the Baruch Plan. So Bernard Baruch at this point is giving a presentation to the United Nations, the brand new body that's supposed to keep peace. And it's a pretty emotional speech here. I mean, you look at that where he's talking about nuclear weapons. If we don't limit them, if we fail, then we have damned every man to be the slave of fear. And when you think about that, I mean, that's true, and that really is what's going to happen, isn't it? So Baruch tries to tell the United Nations, we should just not use nuclear weapons again. Let's all commit to not making them, and let's not use them again. And Stalin is not going to buy any of that. Now, what we know now is Stalin was hard at work on his own nuclear weapon, which, by the way, he will successfully test in 1949. So then it's an even playing field, right? So Stalin's like, well, U.S., if you dismantle all yours, then maybe we'll think about this. So tensions are still high, and I think this was a nice attempt, almost in the style of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, to just say, hey, let's just sign it and say we'll never do it, and that'll work, right? Well, no, it doesn't work. I think the scientists who were making the bomb all called this. They said, this is the point of no return. You cannot ever have a take back of this thing. And once it's out there, it's out there. And that's exactly what happened. Now, the Truman Doctrine is when Harry Truman decided to pledge support for Greece and Turkey when communism was threatening to kind of take over, as it was really through all of Europe. I mean, Europe was, remember, just devastated by World War II. And England and France, sort of the traditional superpowers in Europe, have had to take a step back because they're devastated too. They've had 2 world wars in 20 years to deal with, just like everybody else. And so the United States is really trying to assert themselves as the new dominant power in the world, along with the Soviet Union, of course, trying to do it the same thing on their end. So Truman pledges support, money and military support, to Greece and Turkey in 1947 and keeps them from becoming communist. So this is basically going to be our policy. We will no longer be isolationists. Those days are done. I mean, our whole policy of our entire country up until 1945 was trying to stay out of things, right? Well, now it's not. Now we're going to actively be involved, and we are going to send troops to places in ways that we never had before. So this is the moment that happens. Here's Churchill giving his famous Iron Curtain speech. There's Harry Truman in St. Louis, Missouri, which is Harry Truman's hometown, where he says an iron curtain has fallen across Europe. And when you look at the Marshall Plan and what it does, you can see where this curtain's going to be. I actually have my freshman world history map this out and draw where the Iron Curtain is. And in some cases, we have physical barriers. There will be a barbed wire fence between Austria and Hungary right here. And then, of course, what happens to Germany is, I think, the most extreme case in the Berlin Wall by 1961 will be another example of a literal curtain. But the Marshall Plan was really focused on economic rebuilding, and it was $13 billion to help rebuild the economies here of Western Europe. It was actually offered to Eastern Europe, but Stalin said, no, I don't want your money. I'll take care of them. But it never happens. So that's the thing. So Eastern Europe doesn't get that sort of head start to rebuild after World War II, and for that reason, it took a long time. All right, the first test in the real crisis here in the Cold War is going to be the Berlin airlift. So when the sectors decided to merge here and form West Germany, Stalin, understandably a little upset about that, so he decided to block Western access to Berlin. And remember, they had also divided Berlin. So this became West Berlin, right here, the yellow on the map, and people here relied on American and French and British supplies. So what Truman basically did was he said, well, if I can't drive there, I'll fly there. And here's what you see happening here. So for 11 months, the United States dropped supplies and medicine and even toys and chocolate bars from the airplanes. So who ends up looking bad here? Stalin ends up looking bad. And he's going to lift this blockade by 1949. But we're going to see this is not going to be the last time Berlin's going to be an issue. And you guys, of course, know where that's headed. We're going to have to, Soviet Union's going to have to put up some kind of a barrier here, because once people could get into West Berlin, well, then they could get out of East Germany. So that's going to be an issue. We'll see that come back up. Japan and China definitely change. Total flip-flop here. Remember, we're trying to defeat Japan during World War II, and China's our ally. Well, that's going to change very quickly after the war ends. This is Chiang Kai-shek, and this is Mao Zedong. And these guys, I know you learned about them in world history, but he's leading the nationalists in China, kind of taking over after Sun Yat-sen, who led that revolution and the 3 principles of the people and all that. This is the guy that the United States is going to support. Mao Zedong is going to lead the communists in China. So this is part of the problem why China was so easy for Japan to take over, because they had this internal struggle for a while. It had been going on for a while. When the war's over, we're going to see that Mao's going to lead kind of a push, and he's going to win. And so Chiang Kai-shek flees to Taiwan. And so that's going to be the China that the United States recognizes as nationalist China, Taiwanese China. We refuse to really recognize or deal with communist China. So this is a huge change. So China goes from being our ally to, because it's not the Cold War and we're afraid of communism and threatened by that, they're now our biggest enemy. The other thing that that's going to do is it's going to make it even more alarming when in 1950 the North Koreans, with the blessing of Stalin, invade the South. So let's pause for a moment and say that North Korea and South Korea were not always divided. They were this peninsula was taken over by Japan. And so the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to each take a portion here, the U.S. taking the south, the Soviets taking the north, dividing at the 38th parallel, and helping them rebuild after World War II. Similar to Berlin and Germany, it wasn't supposed to be permanent. Well, famous last words, right? So what ends up happening in 1950 is Kim Il-sung, the leader of the North, got the go-ahead from Stalin to invade the South. Well, this is the first time that we're going to see the United Nations used, and UN troops. It's actually a UN action. It's mostly made up of American forces, but it's still technically, this is a UN action. We never got a formal declaration of war from the United States. So Harry Truman uses those United Nations and leads an invasion right here at Incheon. And the general in charge of all the UN forces was Douglas MacArthur, the hero of the Pacific. Okay, so first, the North invades the South, pushes them down to Pusan. The Incheon landing pushes back to the 38th parallel. The Americans get control of the South, hand Seoul back to the South Koreans, Syngman Rhee, their leader. Now here's the thing, though. The Americans and the United Nations troops decided to keep going. So MacArthur kind of told Truman, look, I got it. Let me keep going. So they do. So now they're invading the North without a whole lot of trouble, okay? The Yalu River is this border between China and North Korea. And the Chinese had made it pretty clear that they were not happy about the UN forces invading North Korea. Well, about Thanksgiving of 1950, most of our soldiers, it was really cold and snowy, and they thought, this is going to be great. We're going to be home by Christmas. Oh, no. In November 1950, almost 500,000 Chinese crossed the Yalu River, joined the war, catching the UN troops totally off guard. It's freezing cold. Nothing's working right. The tanks aren't, going. The engines aren't working. The guns aren't firing, and our troops are on the run. So MacArthur had sworn to Truman that this wasn't going to happen, and it did. So not only is MacArthur mad, Truman's furious. MacArthur wants to invade China and possibly even use nuclear weapons there. Whoops, let me go back here. Well, that's too much for Truman. Truman fires MacArthur. So for Truman to fire the hero of the Pacific really made Truman's popularity just plummet in the United States. And a lot of people just didn't really understand what we were doing there. Why is this happening? But of course, the answer will always be in the Cold War. We have to. It's the domino effect. If one falls, they all fall. And we've got to make sure this doesn't happen. So when all is said and done, the fighting goes back, forth, and eventually we end up with a truce here in 1953 that ends up exactly where we started. What's the difference? Well, now we've lost 54,000 Americans in Korea. And to put that in a frame of reference, we lose 54,000 Americans in a little over 2.5 years in Korea. We lose 58,000 in 7 years in Vietnam. So it's a lot of lives lost, not to mention 3 million Koreans are killed, which is also kind of some foreshadowing of what's about to happen here. These so-called limited wars and these wars of containment are really tough on the people, the civilians that are there. Not to mention the Americans, because a lot of people at home are really saying, why are we there? We don't understand. It's not like in World War II. We were attacked, right? And it was clear. And everybody at home was behind that war. And you don't see that in Korea. And you definitely do not see that in Vietnam. So Korea, we certainly don't win, but we definitely don't lose, because South Korea will stand, and it continues to stand today. This 38th parallel, this DMZ, remains the most guarded border in the world. And I know you guys in 8th grade, I think, got to go to D.C. and saw the monument. My Uncle Jack fought in Korea, my great-uncle. And he never got to see this, unfortunately. He passed away before. I think he really would have liked it. But I really like how it's just the expression on all the soldiers' faces. And it was so cold. I think a lot of people don't realize that, how cold it was when they were retreating. But they still followed their orders, and they fought bravely for the United States and the United Nations mission. And South Korea, without a doubt, wouldn't exist today without this action. So anyways, this is kind of where we're ending here in this particular unit. I would just have a good understanding of the causes of the Korean War and the effects, and sort of how it's setting up the future of what we're about to see in our next unit. And that is the end of Unit 12.